And the attitude towards master-slave has been defined Western culture so long that we don't even know where it springs from. This master-slave is the objectification, subject and object. You see, subject and object are one. Whenever we see someone, we see our own self. We don't see other. We see our own consciousness reflected through the organs of perception and cognition. This is the beauty of the Shaivites philosophy, which also was a smack to the original Brahmanical tradition in India back in the days. Tantra, when it rose, was a revolutionary teaching. Not just like today, studying Tantra is safe and easy. Back in the days, it was a revolutionary teaching. So going back to this ideology, the Nazism was sold on the ground that European civilization is in danger of being destroyed from without. That there is an imminent danger that the values of European civilization is under threat. Why? I hope it's clear for all of us gathered that it's not really what will be added into the discourse right now on our last full day. It's not, let's say, what yet to be added into the discourse, what we can, let's say, cover from and on top of, from where we have left it, to add to the, let's say, coffers of spiritual knowledge. But rather, what I would like to give this particular hour for maybe a sweeping overview, like literally something that I have been attempting to do, confessing, falling flat on my face in most cases because of a sheer complexity, intricacy of all this, how it's interconnected. Because my life is too much on the go. I don't have the luxury of, let's say, giving myself fully to that intellectual enterprise where people come up with refined enough, deep enough, broad enough philosophical systems and concepts. Maybe one day later on in life, I don't know. Maybe. But the way the life has been was more of that, of a nomad, on the go. On the go. Even our children, life with Amrita Madevi, which I'm blessed because she's literally a rolling stone like myself, even if she doesn't know it. And it doesn't mean she has to be the fan of the band. It's what it means, what it represents. Loose canon, which requires, in a way, otherwise one would go mental. Even raising the children in that rolling stone way of life. At the very same time, not for a day, I lost the awareness of how everything sits together, how everything is interconnected. How everything interrelated. So what felt to me already quite early on, even though I could not quite yet see it as clearly as I hopefully do now, that kind of promised land, that kind of just place the emphasis on here and now, right? That power of now. Just do your job. Just tend to what you're doing right here, right now, work on yourself, and everything will somehow fall into place. Perhaps also this is a certain predispositions that some of us are born with for a synthesis, for simply already knowing, already being affected by the fact that one has bitten into that forbidden fruit. Therefore, one can't pretend that one remains in the innocence of unknowing, in the innocence of not knowing. And it became clear at some point how that what we blame so much, that what we claim to be the culprit, that where we look for the error, that's where the whole spirituality of at least the last 100 years have been trying to direct and guide spiritual seekers so that they settle their affairs straight in terms of, like, let's say, identifying two primary evils or two primary, let's say, reasons. It's the same in this case, ego and mind. So just work on your ego, and the mind is not needed at all. And at some point, what we need to realize is that there are some other structures at work. Our sense of identity is not autonomous. Yes, we can speak about it with this understanding, and I would like and hope we will have enough time to touch upon the universality of what, let's say, Trickoshavism brings as an offering into, let's say, unbelievably rich landscape of spiritual traditions, simply by virtue of settling the tension between subject and object. As an immediate footnote to the topic we will come back, is because by virtue of objectifying anything is that we create the rupture of division. By virtue of objectifying, this objectification towards nature cost us price today in terms of the questions of ecology, questions of agriculture, which in turn translates into the question of practically all illnesses without exception. Because agriculture and the way we feed ourselves directly reflects in the health of the nation. The objectification of so-called perceived enemy obfuscates us from any moral responses when it comes to viewing others as a target. You know that famous dialogues the snipers receive? Target is ready. Not person is ready. Not so-and-so is ready. Target. It's a target. It's an object. Object which is now subject to the release of the trigger. And I'm just giving this example of snipers who are, let's say, doesn't matter, in the military combat or a paid assassin. In order to have no moral quibbles, one can only have relationship with another as a target. This target can be then translated into the domain of the economic enterprise, where we target others in the form of deals, in the form of arrangements, in the form of some kind of, what do they call this? What's the term? The term just evaded me. Contractual agreement, which, effectively speaking, replaced entirely the concept of offering, sacrifice, that we have spoken purely from esoteric dimension of what it represents in a given culture. So this objectification is not a shortcoming of an individual living today by a result of a certain ideology adopted at a certain time by the shepherds of society. Because we live in what is defined by now postmodern age. It was called just postmodern, and then another post is added. And you can see the distinction, if you will, on your own when you Google this distinction. What is postmodernism characterized by? What is the leitmotif? What is the novel idea? Postmodernism is a desperate attempt at reconcile deepest issues, dilemmas that our society have faced with the collapse of certain, what is then, by then, began to be seen outlived ideas which served as cohesive narrative to bind society. And the need to come up with something new, which will be liberating, which will be freeing. And of course, this is the subject of all these, let's say, debates, analysis, reviews of the past, let's say, 150 years, but really, more like 500 years, taking us all the way to the ideas of the Renaissance. I have touched, or at least attempted to touch upon this, because the Renaissance was already a kind of postmodern ideology, if we are to use that term, for the people of the Renaissance who were trying to overcome, let's say, the loss of certain values which were represented by medieval ages. And very often from that humanistic perspective, because of the discoveries of more ancient civilization through discoveries of ancient writings, or writings of the ancients rather, and archaeological excavations of, let's say, something known in Rome as, what is it in Rome? The whole excavated area? Do you remember? Forum, right? This whole area which was suddenly digging out, and Rome was built on top of another Rome. And that led further and further excavation and bringing out into the open these relics of the classical Mediterranean civilization, as then it will be dubbed by scholars. Classical world of the Greeks. First, it was exclusively spoken of as the Greeks, the cradle of Western European civilization, where some of the most important notions and ideals have been formed, including the ideas of liberal democracy that today replaced, effectively speaking, the faith. This is the subject which is so tricky, it's like a quicksand. So we're not going to go into that, because that also will be kind of revisiting what has been said. I would like to keep this kind of, as I said, that more of a sweeping overview in the context of our gathering, as we have gathered to probe into this. And the suggestions that I have for all of you gathered here, including myself, because I'm pronouncing something out into the open that is not preconceived, but rather something that evolved with this, what have been, let's say, evolving over a period of time, and only when given the context of the setting and the chance to communicate this, began to be seen, let's say, for the very first time, what it could be. So this sweeping overview, this, let's say, historical perspective, this landscape of how certain ideologies form and inform our being, is of utmost importance, because we cannot apply spiritual teaching per se onto ourselves and hoping it somehow will configure itself independently from what otherwise constantly forming us. You see? So this is almost becomes an impossible task. The task which can actually backfire and derail many of us in the attempt to free ourselves from what we consider to be the limitations, the aforementioned, let's say, ego, the aforementioned mind, to become free, to merge with the absolute, with the transcendent, so that we can live happily ever after, as it goes. So that dilemma that in Renaissance was presented with a lot of still of that bubbling sense of novelty and enthusiasm, because this is also chiefly coincided with the break into the era of industrial revolution. It's inseparable like this. And it's also inseparable, of course, from the era of colonialism. Very important, colonialism. What is colonialism? You probably all have some ideas of what colonialism is. Colonialism is basically going to any part of the world and simply colonizing it. Oh, voila. What a philosophical statement. There's nothing to beat about the bush there. Colonialism is that. Is going somewhere and getting something that one cannot get at home. And getting it by hook or by crook, by word or by sword. Doesn't matter. By word meaning indoctrination. That's the whole concept of secret order of Jesuits. You first convert people into another faith, our faith, because they are blinded, they're ignorant. They don't know the way of God. They don't know the word. They don't know logos. Once you do that, you don't need to do anything. You'll save on the army because they join the army of Christ. You study this just for yourselves. You will see how the world was functioning. So all these ideas, when I studied history of art, it was all neat and tidy. You know how beautiful the history of art? Oh, suddenly we dug out of that body of Zeus, perfectly formed human being, before the era of the protein shakes and all that juice. Human body built to perfection by sheer natural organic agriculture. With everything, with every part still not need to be covered by any fig leaves, just as it is, on display. Hoo-ha, ooh-la-la, and now we have the whole Renaissance artists now exercising their skills and doing their own versions. David is one of them. And many, many others. Suddenly our streets, our piazzas are filled with these naked figures. It's beautiful. The art history is magnificent. Look at the Botticelli, the birth of Venus. Poetic. All this at the very same time coincides with colonial conquest. All this coincides. Money has to come to flock back into the coffers of the patrons. So the patrons will commission great works of art. And so it goes. So the idea of the Renaissance is not inseparable from the idea of industrial revolution, where suddenly we begin to replace the like a manual labor with machinery, technology. This way, of course, the baby steps, the very, very early stages of what industrial revolution will truly represent, let's say by the 19th century, in a city like London, which is inseparable from that process. The glory of London is that it became the capital of the seat of the empire and as the greatest port where all the goods were imported, where everything was brought from far away, and of course, where the most modern technologies were employed, where the flocked to the city at the expense of utterly and entirely destroying the agricultural life of the island. How many of you are aware of that, let's say, axis of resistance among the peasants of the two countries, in France and England, as they were trying to resist the progressive industrialization, because that would mean their way of life will be wiped out. And in England, it was wiped out. In England, before the Sainsbury and Tesco's and all the supermarkets rose, there was already a prototype of a system of what will later be known as what? How does it call? What do we call that? Right?
Capitalism.
Well, capitalism, of course. Capitalism was already in full swing before that. It's the whole concept of globalization, right? Where the corporations take over. This began much earlier. In England, these corporations were formed. In England, in the United States, all this, the biggest corporation of all time was West Indies. West Indies, the slavery trade, is the biggest corporation of its time. Its interconnection to all industries are proverbial. It was literally holding control of the entire production and import of everything, export. Not just human trafficking, because that's what it was. Slavery is a human trafficking. It's taking the labor from somewhere for literally peanuts and turning it to pure gold. I'm not going to go and start hitting the sentiments which are by now should be clearly explored by each and every conscientious being. But going back to that attempts that I want to point our attention to, attempts at finding new ideologies. Why? Why there is a need for new ideologies? Why there is a need? Well, that somehow is rooted in that connection between the essence and form, between the idea and form, right? Like that kind of balance that is exemplified by Namarupa. So these ideas, ideologies, when there is some form of balance between what the initial faith idea represents and the form with which it is exercised, maintains, people can live in relative state of coherence. People can understand what everyone's job is, what everyone's is doing. But soon as the idea exhausts itself, then out of necessity, the form begins to dominate. And when the form begins to dominate, autocratic approaches are a must. They're simply a response to that. Because if there is nothing that holds people from acting outside of the moral code of conduct, there need to be a system of punishment. If people functioning within the framework of the ideological grounds on the account of shared consensus, really the need for what? Prisons, judges, and persecutors is much, much less. Because it is maintained at that level. It is maintained at the level where that is being squared at the place where one believes in something. And by virtue of believing in something, one is already walking the line, if you will. But soon as that line begins to get, let's say, a windy and sometimes trespassing in and out, at times lost, and one have to redefine it, it all indicates that the sacred dimension is withering. And at that time, form becomes that inquisition. Forms becomes the system of punishment. These are the autocratic approaches that every government will begin to implement to remain what? To remain things in order, to keep things in order. So I give this frivolous analogy of my own. I haven't never had this done before, so it may be completely unfound, but to me it felt that the attempt for postmodernism took place as far back as circa 500-600 years ago, maybe even at the onset of Renaissance. Certainly by the 15th century, this was all in swing. This was clearly the ideas to redefine and reconcile that, let's say, more antique past, more ancient history with the Christian faith. Because by that time, what started to be observed is a weakening of that. So in other words, this revamp was required. So again, going back to the history of art, which I'm most familiar and most intimately aware of in terms of its being my subject. I studied it, I had to, and I loved it. Until I realized not everything are spick and span. You can't study history of art independently from military history. And you can't study military history independently from the history of religions. All is interconnected. Surprise, surprise. When I look at the Battle of Uccello, these battalias, these huge long canvases, I'm marveled at how it's given that aesthetical form. Men on horses, knights, this formidable picture. The subject beloved by the boys, right? In all the armor. And you have these bushes of camellia blossoming. And there you can see red camellias torn from the bush to symbolize the blood. How beautiful, how aesthetically elevating. I'm beholding that young man in my 30th year in Florence, in Uffizi. And then, of course, on the way back, I begin to ponder. I begin to ponder of the complexity of it all, the purpose of art, what it's supposed to convey here. Is it to decorate that beautiful palazzo, which already is stunning, and to give it yet another, let's say, infusion of that aesthetic delight for the nobility to dine with the background of those battalias, those knights of Templar, those heroes sitting, let's say, sharing a meal with the episcopacy, with the religious clergy. And whilst at the very same time, something else is being formed and also deformed. So this whole notion of individuality cannot be looked upon squarely without understanding the repercussions of our collective history, to understand the full complexity of what it represents. Because we live yet another phase where the postmodernism, now speaking in relation to the postmodernism proper, as it has been defined as an attempt to create a bridge from past into the future, where people of Western civilization, we're speaking of now in particular, found themselves at the end of the 19th century, where that bridge was absolute necessity, because all this, what was, let's say, preached, has simply turned into something else. So this rise of psychology, rise of independent thinking, the onslaught of spiritual teachings from the Orient into the Western soil began as far as back then. And the ideas of postmodernism and why and what postmodernism is and what its main characteristics is that postmodernism actually doesn't know yet what it believes into. It doesn't offer any truly valid, let alone sacred alternative. What it does instead, it plays that intellectual game with the past, whilst flirting with the ideas of the future, most iconically represented by the works of, let's say, avant-garde artists, right? When Marcel Duchamp draws the moustache on the reproduction of Mona Lisa and names it in French, "She's hard," he's playing the intellectual game, the game accessible only to the aesthetes. He's creating a work of art which severed its uninterrupted link through visual representation, and he creates a new form, new dialogue, new conversation. Marcel Duchamp is just an example. We can see that in the ideas in architecture, the ideas of, let's say, constructivists, the ideas of that were proposed by the Bauhaus, stripping every form to its bare essential. Get rid of all these entourages and decorations that were characterized previous epoch, the so-called culture of the bourgeois. And this of course, all together, again, would have to be viewed disillusionment in religious ideals. Whilst maybe simple folk still goes to church in Belfast, in Rome, in Krakow, in whatever last plots of stronghold of Christian faith there are, the intellectuals of the time already looking for healthier in their understanding, psychologically freer systems of belief. And so this is postmodernism. And this postmodernism runs pretty much into cul-de-sac because there's nothing that it can offer. And let's now make the most important connection, because the ideas of postmodernism cannot be viewed purely only in relation to culture. It is inseparable from what's taking place in the government, in the governments, and among those who were placed in the position of shepherding their nations, shepherding the countries. So in other words, the economical system itself is not separate from the ideas of postmodernism, where it tries to bring technocratic ideas as a replacement for the old dying or dead God, with these hopes that somehow we're entering this exhilarating future where the technologies now, that technology is potentially, possibly, the new realm where we will shake off all this unwanted dust, unwanted all that, let's say, centuries upon centuries, that we finally want to find ourselves freer in our enterprise, freer in our being, stripped bare of all this, what otherwise carried like a heavy load of that inheritance. So it will be important, of course, immediately to add that any counter movements that inevitably were produced within this briefly outlined picture cannot be really seen as truly offering any true way forward, because if someone there comes and like, well, let's revive something, or let's restore something. We have the same people now who are very much crusades for Western culture. And I will make this quite drastic analogies, but please don't hold me to that, because I will soften the edges. But first, to the contrast. It is very well known that the intellectuals of the early 20th century, the first quarter of the 20th century, all have bought the ideas that would drive the world insane. That is the Nazi ideology. How many of you are aware why so many bank accounts and so many credits were issued? Many of them by the richest Jewish families in Switzerland. So the genocide of Jewish people during the Holocaust was not done in complete darkness. because these are not master Jews. They belong to the white niggers. They are slaves. And the attitude towards master-slave has been defined Western culture so long that we don't even know where it springs from. This master-slave is the objectification, subject and object. You see, subject and object are one. Whenever we see someone, we see our own self. We don't see other. We see our own consciousness reflected through the organs of perception and cognition. This is the beauty of the Shaivites' philosophy, which also was a smack to the original Brahmanical tradition in India back in the days. Tantra, when it rose, was a revolutionary teaching. Not just like today, studying Tantra is safe and easy. Back in the days, it was a revolutionary teaching. So going back to this ideology, the Nazism was sold on the ground that European civilization is in danger of being destroyed from without. That there is an imminent danger that the values of European civilization is under threat. Why? Because already there were signs, but still far from dissolution of the colonies. It became clear that maintaining the colonial rule becoming more and more cumbersome. For example, for the Brits, India was suckled almost to starvation. How much and what else can be taken from the country, which now became the poorest country in the world? And yet you have to maintain that. You have to maintain the empire. So this, let's say, ideologies that sooner or later there will be this onslaught wave into the European culture, which will threaten the very, what was considered to be the highest achievement of entire civilization on the planet. So I'm not talking about what was written in Mein Kampf. I'm talking about the conversation from behind the scenes, the conversations that took place in closed-door banquets held in Switzerland and in Bavaria. We're talking about those, let's say, gatherings where the ideologies, the architects of the Nazi ideology were selling the wealthy and the elite the idea that they are here to preserve. So they were coming as saviors. These are the crusaders. Crusaders who are willing to pay with their life for the values of Western civilization. And this was carried out as a project, as a big project, that the power and everything was usurped. How far the ambitions of, let's say, the leaders of the Nazi regime maybe was not known at the time. But these are speculations. The main speculation is to assume that those who were financing Hitler's machine were unaware of its ambition. No, they were financing it out of the shared ideology. You see? Out of the shared ideology. Because the world is crumbling. It is crumbling. We've mentioned the name of Rudolf Steiner yesterday, right? During that broadcast. Rudolf Steiner's books were forbidden in Germany. I don't know exactly from which year. Maybe somewhere circa mid-30s. Maybe late 30s. All Waldorf schools were shut down. How many of you know that? Why? It was done out of necessity. You can't have Rudolf Steiner's work out there. It contradicts the very paradigm that is being built now. Narrative. Paradigm. Narrative. So, making a leap now into our time, we have now been faced with even greater crisis. Greater crisis because we live through another collapse of all the values, above all else ideological values, because the belief in technocratic revolution is now reached its limit, because we came to the point of when artificial intelligence potentially is the new reality of what technological advancement can bring. And of course, the talks that will further divide to create the disparity between the super wealthy and the basic, let's say, wages of people who maintain life at a certain level will increase, because it will coincide with loss of many jobs, because these jobs would simply become obsolete. They will no longer be needed. But these are only symptoms. And what comes to the fore is these attempts, again, to save Western civilization. Notice how there is this constant attempts to save Western civilization. This constant attempt to Western redefine the values of Western civilization. Take the likes of Shapiro or Peterson. These are the New Time Crusades. These are the people who have joined the Ark, right? They have this organization. They are signed the pact to be, let's say, primarily represented in a social media format. We know that. We know where the paycheck to whom the paycheck belongs. But what's interesting is that these attempts at reconciling the loss of ideology with the revival of Christian faith, as it is bankruptly exercised by the demagogue Jordan Peterson, is all too obvious. The man who professes finding the teachings of Christ displays zero qualities that one would expect from what? The pious Christian. No, it's only ideological blabber. Of course, delivered with a supreme level of rhetorics, with a supreme command of language. Man of letters. He can do it, he can deliver. And many other speakers also of that same caliber who are doing that. They are at the forefront of these crusades of saving Western civilization. From whom? From what? Who is threatening Western civilization? Why Western civilization is threatened? Oh, come on, Igor, are you out of your mind? Don't be so simple. Isn't that straightforward? We all be converted into Islam if we don't go into another war. We all will be Muslims, praying 5 times a day, hitting our heads against the floor. Because that's what is now prophesied. And some people out there will carry it out. So therefore we need to bomb countries, as we did it on the summer solstice. We need to bomb nuclear facilities. It's just as a reminder add to that conversation. Simply for exercise in whether we still function in this department. So Iran, country which yet to be proved in the possession of nuclear bomb, atomic bomb, has signed a declaration of the United Nations under the article of not using nuclear weapon. Country that is sanctioned up to its neck, and country which allows experts from any countries to come and do their job of inspection. And Israel is the country which is not sanctioned by any country in the world. It's a paradise of free trade. It is the country which has nuclear bomb, which did not sign the declaration for not using that bomb. Okay? And it's the country that does not allow inspectors of any other countries, including that from the United States, to come and examine the state of affairs of how Israel conducts this nuclear energy, let's say, programs. So, okay, let me think about that. Let me think about that. It's interesting. Let's ask Jordan Peterson. That will be very interesting, because we will hear very, very good response. It will be intellectually charged, stimulating response. It might even produce such wave and rush of enthusiasm and maybe add some appetite. So when I go to my table, I will be absolved of all this otherwise fog of confusion. Yeah. Double standards? Could it be called double standards? I'm just wondering. No, it's not double standards. It's a fight for civilizational setup. And fight for civilizational setup it is. It is agreed in every camp. It is historical and symbolical that Israel should create this act of terrorist explosions and bomb Iran unprovoked, and Iran simply happening to represent that axis of resistance. This is why I said in one of the previous discourses that I stand with Iran, not because I stand with the ideology of Ayatollah or Khomeinis. It's not because I share the orthodox ideology of Republic of Islam. Let's not just start here putting it all in the same kind of pile. It is because Iran represents here that change in the axis of resistance. It simply happened to be Iran in a given moment in time. It simply happened to be the first country, the first slave on a grand scale that rises and tells the master, I'm not going to turn another cheek. I'm going to defend myself and my interests and the interests of my country, and I'm no longer your vassal. And it says that openly because it formed connections. The whole world shunned Iran from trade, following these heavy sanctions imposed by United States under the guidance of Israel and Zionist ideology, only to create the possibility for Iran to exercise the marvel of survival by reaching out to all its neighbors and forging eventually economic connections, fruitful economic connections with countries that we have mentioned the other day. China, Russia, Pakistan, India, whatever other countries, Brazil, you begin to name. It's a huge, huge number of countries that all formed, not all formed eventually. Iran is the last entry into the BRICS. So the assault on Iran is an assault of an old system of masters that treats the rest of the world independently of what color you are. As I said, I use that term consciously. You can be white, but you will be treated as a white nigger. And it doesn't matter how this and that and whatever is allowed. It's a charade to portray that somehow, oh yes, we can have a first black African-American president. I watched many times that moment when young Putin, in his direct conversation, in a meeting with Barack Obama, and I studied it psychologically, it was exactly that. The one who has been brought up with the attitude, I'm the master, speaking to a vassal who simply wouldn't budge. That's how Obama treated Putin. Even the camera could not hide that, and they didn't even cut it. The smirk that he had when Putin suggested, why doesn't Russia join NATO? Why? We don't need NATO. NATO came as a result to balance the power formed a year earlier by Warsaw Pact. So Warsaw Pact gave birth to NATO. There we have Berlin Wall. World is divided. Europe is divided. The Warsaw Pact is dissolved. Russia becomes capitalist, as I said. Best brand shops I've seen in Moscow. Size of Chanel, of Bulgari, in Moscow is bigger than in Rome and London. The capitalism is booming. The amount of Mercedes-Benz latest ones are still in Moscow, not in Düsseldorf, let alone Berlin. No. So why NATO? What's the purpose this transatlantic bloc is serving here? And when young Putin there suggests that, Obama turns to his and does that. Just like, not like that, just this is a smirk of a master to a slave who can come up with such suggestions. And of course, why internet is so full of humble origins of Putin. After all, where does he come from? What is his background? Small little putler. That's what we, there's a, I always forget, kids correct me, meme or mem? Meme. The meme was tried to create out of that, and successfully was for a time being. Putler. Right? It's sort of like, the direct connotations. This small man ambition is right, so he rises to power, and now he's, mark my words, that's also the axis of resistance, because what we're seeing now is going to be decided between the members, the most powerful members of the BRICS, represented by Russia and China, simply because of their arsenal. And they cannot forgo Iran. They can't. And that's why there is so much danger. You see? Because Iran took the bullet and it decided that it's not going to swallow it. And yes, it knew also that it is no longer alone. So what we see here is the shift, the gigantic shift. And what we could say about this in terms of geopolitics of the situation, the proxy war in Ukraine, which was supposed to bleed Russia to death, as Afghanistan was supposed to bleed Soviet Union to death, by all that CIA plans masterminded painstakingly and presented to the government by the likes of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who served to the number of presidents until he basically retired of the old age. And when he wrote his memoirs, he said, we lost that geopolitical power in the region. And he was prophesying that unless we can turn Ukraine in that second Afghanistan, then there's no hope. Unstoppable. This process is unstoppable. America will lose its geopolitical domination in the world because it's already lost it in Asia. Because of the alliance that is being formed there. Because of the alliance that was prophesied there as early as 25 years ago. So now, at the time when Putin only came to power, when Russia was in pits in terms of its economy, that Putin's cabinet inherited from Yeltsin, who basically sold Russia, where Russian constitution was rewritten with 200 American experts breathing down the neck of people who were rewriting Russian constitution, so as to make sure Russia will be the new and the biggest market for complete and utter exploration. That's master-slave dynamics. That's the dynamics of subject-object. Objectify your whatever you want to then dominate. This cannot be and will never be spiritual approach. So what we're seeing here in the geopolitical arena, we're seeing the major shift. I'm not saying to you, oh, yeah, there is a country of great ideological orientation. No, that's why I gave epical examples, because great heroes sometimes have to take the wrong side of battle due to their integrity. In the example of exemplified by someone like Bhishma. Who knows? You don't know this, but to me, this like, why epics anyway? Well, I speak from personal experience. For me, being introduced to the lore of ancient India, just in these two works, Mahabharata and Ramayana, shed light on the deepest aspects of my psyche. the deepest aspect of my psyche, whilst I was going through the wild awakening, whilst I was going through the profound transformation, still aspects of psyche needed to be lit, needed to be brought out into the open. And this is where it came. Bhishma, on the side of Kauravas, fighting out of integrity because of his oath, which he uttered at once, in one breath. One, never to be with a woman because of that, what he had to experience with, right, with what's her name, Amber, right? And because of his military position, military training, he gives an oath to protect the kingdom irrespective of who will be the ruler. So it's just happened that Dhritarashtra, the blind king, would be the king of that, forgot the name, Paratashtra, forgive me, the name of that kingdom. So he's true to his oath, even though we know very well that his heart is with Arjuna, Yudhishthira, Ashwins, Bhima, with Pandavas. His heart, he knows they are on the right side of history. Yet he is true to his oath, he fights against them. There is a whole scripture known. You know that? When Bhishma is shot with hundreds of arrows. This is most powerful account of this, most painful as well in the same very time, is as the body of Bhishma was shot with so many arrows, right? When he collapsed, he couldn't fall down. He was held by these arrows, which were gently penetrating into his flesh under his weight. And he remained there for days still alive. And at that moment, he narrated this most famous, hidden deep within the Indian lore. This is the song of Bhishma. The teachings of the great warrior that he narrates from there, how he meets this final hour. Why am I saying this? Is that countries represent these dynamics just as human beings represent the dynamics here. And it's just happened that we live in the time when something just something relatively maybe insignificant becomes significant. Some shift happens, something. We don't even know what made Trump to make this decision on the night of the summer solstice to bomb nuclear facilities in Iran. One of them is unreachable by normal bombing. This is a still unanswered question. Maybe we will receive an answer. It's under the mountain. The only way to take it down is by nuking it. You can't bomb it at the surface. There's no technology, no bomb available to bomb that facility. Yet that facility is listed by and acknowledged by military command of the United States being bombed. Cross on this. It's liquidated. How could that possibly be? Hopefully the answers will come. The point here is that when Tulsi Gabbard, who Donald Trump, as you know, appointed as the chief of secret, what is it? Americans here, please?
Secret Service?
Exactly. She's the chief of Secret Service, the first woman. Very bright woman as far as I'm concerned. She gave the report just a few weeks ago that the information available to the Secret Service of the United States, together with the Mossad, gives no indication whatsoever that Iran is in a possession or anywhere near creating atomic bomb. So this is why it is no longer even playing cleanly the scenario of, because certain scenarios cannot be rewritten. This is too long, too boring. The scenario of taking Saddam Hussein based on false grounds that there's a factories for chemical weapon. These factories were never found. They never existed. The documents that were presented on the table of the President Bush clearly indicated we did not find anything. Classified. We're bombing nevertheless. Thank you for your job. Good job, gentlemen. This is how business done. Okay? So before we, at the danger of missing here why bringing it, I want to simply say that we cannot see this without the context of what's unfolding. So that even that bringing out introduction into potential master training program here is not like, I'm going to teach you how to teach. That's not the idea. The whole point is it's an experiment in consciousness that we're entering together, those who are interested and willing to see this interdynamics, how everything is interconnected. And perhaps it's going to be an open project into decades to come, because we as human beings have to cast for ourselves a new destiny. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. Jordan Petersons of our time have no and nothing to offer in terms of true vision of really where to take it, except lamenting for the lost world. Lamenting for the lost world. Wearing a full suit, like an armor, and a tie in the morning for a conversation from his home shows what goes into his head. It's just pathetic. It's better to come in a full bathroom robe. That will be more honest, straightforward. Like Julian Schnabel used to go to the openings in the gallery in New York, top galleries, Tony Shafrazi, Gogosian, in his evening lingerie. He will go into his pajamas. That's how he was known, because he's an artist. It's his statement. Maybe they were pure silk. He didn't care for the suits and shoes and whatever, slippers and ready for bed. So, humor hopefully will save us, along with seeing things clearly.